I still remember the exact moment I held that check for $5 million. My hands were trembling, not from excitement, but from the weight of what I was about to do. At 59 years old, I thought I knew my family. I thought I understood the bonds that held us together. But sometimes life has a way of showing you truths you never wanted to see. The real estate agent had just left my kitchen table, leaving behind paperwork that would change everything. The old house on Maple Street that my grandmother had left me 20 years ago had become a gold mine. What started as a modest family home in a quiet Nashville neighborhood had transformed into prime development property. $5 million. The number kept echoing in my mind like a song I couldn't shake. Kenneth was at work, probably buried in his accounting files, completely unaware that our lives were about to take a dramatic turn. My children. Brandon and Amanda were busy with their own successful careers, their own families, their own priorities. They called occasionally, visited, even less, but I had convinced myself that was just modern family life. Everyone was busy, everyone had their own struggles. But as I sat there in my empty kitchen, staring at that life-changing number, something shifted inside me. Maybe it was the years of feeling invisible in my own family. Maybe it was watching my 82-year-old Aunt Dorothy struggle to make ends meet on her Social Security while my own children drove luxury cars and lived in expensive homes. Maybe it was the loneliness that had been growing in my chest like a slow poison. I had spent 35 years working in human resources, helping other families navigate their workplace conflicts, their benefit packages, their retirement plans. I had become an expert at reading people, at understanding what motivated them, what scared them, what revealed their true character. But somehow, I had never turned that analytical eye toward my own family. I had been living in a comfortable illusion, believing that love was automatic, that blood always says, meant loyalty. The house sale would be my test, not intentionally at first, but as the idea formed in my mind, I realized this was my chance to see who really cared about Victoria Thompson, the person not Victoria Thompson, the provider, the safety net, the woman who always had everything under control. I decided to keep the sale secret. Nobody needed to know about the windfall, not yet. Instead, I would create a situation that would reveal everyone's true nature. A financial crisis that would require help, support, sacrifice. I would ask each family member for $10,000, claiming I had made a terrible investment mistake and needed immediate help to avoid losing everything. The plan felt both cruel and necessary. Part of me hoped I was wrong about them, hoped that my husband and children would rally around me without question. But deep down, I already suspected what I would discover. The signs had been there for years. I had just been too afraid, too hopeful, too invested in maintaining family harmony to acknowledge them. As I locked the house deed in my safe that evening, I whispered a small prayer. Not for the money, but for the strength to handle whatever truth was about to unfold. The story of my family really begins with loss, the way so many stories do. I was barely 8 years old when my father collapsed at his construction job, his heart giving out under the Tennessee summer heat. One moment, he was building someone else's dream home. The next, he was gone, leaving behind a young wife, 2 little girls, and a mountain of medical debt that seemed impossible to climb. My mother, bless her soul, tried to hold everything together. She worked double shifts at the textile factory, her fingers raw from the machines, her back aching from the long hours. But even with her determination, we were drowning. The bills kept coming, the grocery money kept running short, and I watched my mother age years in the span of months. That's when Aunt Dorothy stepped in, like an angel we didn't know we needed. She was only 25 then, fresh out of nursing school, with dreams of her own that she quietly set aside to help raise my sister and me. Dorothy, moved into our cramped two-bedroom house without complaint, sleeping on the pull-out couch, and turning our chaos into something that resembled stability. I remember how she would braid my hair each morning before school, her gentle fingers working through the tangles while she hummed old hymns. She never made me feel like a burden, never acted like she was sacrificing anything important. But I knew, even as a child, that she was giving up pieces of her own life to make sure mine had a foundation. When other young women her age were dating and building careers, Dorothy was helping with homework, packing lunches, and sitting by my bedside when I had the flu. She worked the night shift at the hospital so she could be home when we got out of school. She saved to every penny to buy us school supplies and Christmas presents, often going without things she needed for herself. My mother remarried when I was 16 to a kind man who brought some financial stability to our home. Most people would have expected Dorothy to move on then, to finally pursue her own dreams. But she stayed close, renting a small apartment just a few blocks away. She said we were her family now, and family didn't abandon each other just because circumstances changed. Dorothy never did marry. She never had children of her own. When I asked her about it once, years later, she just smiled and said that God had given her 2 daughters to love, in my sister and me. She claimed she never felt like she had missed out on anything, that watching us grow up and build our own families filled her heart completely. She was there for my high school graduation, my wedding to Kenneth, the births of both Brandon and Amanda. She was the one who held my hand during my mother's funeral 15 years ago, the one who helped me navigate the grief that threatened to swallow me whole. Through every milestone, every crisis, every ordinary Tuesday, Dorothy was my constant. Now, at 82, she lived alone in a tiny apartment, her arthritis making it hard to get around her fixed income, barely covering her medications and rent. But she still called me every Sunday morning, still remembered every birthday and anniversary, still offered to help whenever she sensed I was struggling. Looking back, I realized Dorothy had been teaching me about unconditional love my entire life. I just hadn't been paying attention. By the time I reached my late 50s, I had to admit that the family I had built with Kenneth bore little resemblance to the one that had raised me. Where Dorothy had shown me warmth and selflessness, I found myself surrounded by people who seemed to view our relationships as transactions, measured by what they could gain rather than what they could give. Kenneth and I had been married for 32 years, and somewhere along the way, we had stopped being partners and become mere roommates. He spent his evenings buried in financial reports, his weekends playing golf with clients, his attention focused on everything except the woman sitting across the breakfast table from him each morning. When I tried to talk about my day, my feelings, my dreams for our future, his responses were distracted, automatic, like he was reading from a script he had memorized decades ago. Our conversations had shrunk to logistics. Who would pick up the dry cleaning when the mortgage payment was due? Whether we needed milk from the store? The emotional intimacy we had once shared had evaporated so gradually that I barely noticed it happening until I woke up one morning and realized I was married to a stranger who happened to know my coffee preferences. Then there were my children, the 2 people I had poured my heart and soul into raising. Brandon, my 33-year-old son, had become a successful financial advisor in Atlanta. He drove a BMW, lived in a gated community, and sent me generic birthday cards purchased by his assistant. Our phone calls were brief and perfunctory, usually ending with him mentioning how busy he was, how many clients were demanding his attention, how little time he had for anything beyond work and his own growing family. When I visited Atlanta last Christmas, I felt like a guest in a hotel rather than a grandmother in her son's home. His wife was polite but distant. Their children barely acknowledged my presence, and Brandon spent most of the weekend checking his phone and talking about market trends. I left feeling more lonely than when I had arrived. Amanda, my 30-year-old daughter, had built a thriving real estate business in Memphis. She was sharp, ambitious, and completely absorbed in climbing the ladder of success. She had inherited Kenneth's ability to turn every conversation toward practical matters, and my attempts to connect on an emotional level were met with impatience and subtle criticism. During our last lunch together, she spent more time photographing her salad for social media than asking about my life. When I mentioned feeling isolated since Kenneth had grown so distant, she suggested I take up gardening or join a book club, as if my loneliness was simply a scheduling problem that could be solved with better time management. Both of my children had inherited my work ethic and Kenneth's ambition, but neither seemed to have absorbed the lessons about family loyalty that Dorothy had taught me. They were generous with expensive gifts on holidays, quick to offer financial advice, eager to show off their achievements, but strangely absent when it came to offering emotional support or genuine companionship. I found myself making excuses for their behavior, telling myself that successful people were naturally busy, that modern families operated differently than the one I had grown up in. But deep down, I knew the truth I was afraid to acknowledge. They had learned to see me as a resource rather than a person, someone who was always available when they needed something, but who didn't require the same consideration in return. The phone call that would alter the course of my life came on a Tuesday morning in March. I was sitting in my office at the food distribution company, reviewing employee benefit packages, when my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. The voice on the other end belonged to Marcus Williams, a real estate developer who had been trying to reach me for weeks. He apologized for the persistent calls, but explained that his company was interested in purchasing the old house on Maple Street that I had inherited from my grandmother 20 years earlier. The property had been sitting empty since Grandma Rose passed away, and I had been paying the property taxes out of habit more than any real plan. It was a modest two-bedroom house in what used to be a quiet residential neighborhood, nothing particularly special or valuable in my mind. But Marcus had news that nearly knocked me out of my chair. The city had approved a major commercial development project for that entire area, and property values had skyrocketed overnight. My little grandmother's house, with its half-acre lot and mature oak trees, was now worth approximately $5 million. $5 million. I had to ask him to repeat the number twice before it sank in. The house I had inherited and forgotten about the property I viewed as more of a burden than an asset had become a life-changing windfall through nothing more than chance and changing city plans. After hanging up the phone, I sat in stunned silence for nearly an hour. My mind raced through the possibilities, the freedom this money could provide, the security it represented. But more than the financial implications, I found myself thinking about what this revelation meant for my relationships, particularly with my family. Over the following weeks, I met with Marcus several times, reviewed the paperwork, had the property appraised by independent assessors. Everything he had told me was true. The sale would be straightforward, the money would be real, and my life would never be the same. But as the reality of my newfound wealth settled in a different kind of awareness began to grow, I started paying closer attention to my interactions with Kenneth, Brandon, and Amanda. I noticed how conversations often turned to money, how they assumed I would always be available to help with their financial needs, how they took my stability and support for granted. Kenneth frequently complained about our retirement savings, hinting that we needed to be more aggressive with our investments. Brandon had mentioned several times that he was looking at expanding his business and might need some capital backing. Amanda had been talking about purchasing investment properties and had asked several pointed questions about my financial situation. None of them had ever directly asked for money, but the implications hung in the air, like smoke creating an atmosphere where I felt more valued for my potential contributions than for who I was as a person. The discovery of my sudden wealth made these dynamics impossible to ignore. I made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. I would keep the house sale secret, at least for now. Instead of announcing my good fortune, I would create a test that would reveal the true nature of my relationships with the people I loved most. The plan began forming in my mind, slowly, carefully, like a puzzle pieces falling into place. I would claim to be in financial trouble, create a crisis that required immediate help, and see who would step forward without question and who would find reasons to step away. While my immediate family had grown distant over the years, there was one relationship in my life that remained as steady as the sunrise. Aunt Dorothy, now 82, and living in a cramped efficiency apartment across town, continued to be the most consistent source of love and support in my world. Every Sunday morning, like clockwork, my phone would ring at exactly 9:15. Dorothy's voice, still strong despite her age, would greet me with genuine enthusiasm and interest in every detail of my week. She remembered the names of my coworkers, asked follow-up questions about projects I had mentioned months earlier, and always seemed to sense when I was struggling, even when I tried to hide it. Her tiny apartment was a testament to a life lived on very little, but with great intention. The walls were covered with photographs of our family, through the decades handmade crafts from church bazaars and small treasures she had collected over the years. Everything had a story, a memory, a connection to someone she loved. The place radiated warmth, despite its modest size and worn furniture. Dorothy's financial situation had become increasingly difficult as she aged. Her Social Security barely covered her rent and basic necessities, and the medications for her arthritis and high blood pressure consumed a significant portion of her monthly budget. I had offered to help her many times over the years, but she always found polite ways to decline, insisting that she was managing just fine and didn't want to be a burden to anyone. But I could see the signs of her struggle. The way she wore the same 3 dresses in rotation, the careful way she planned her grocery trips to take advantage of every sale, the fact that she rarely turned on her air conditioning, even during the hottest Tennessee summers. She never complained, never asked for anything, never made anyone feel guilty about her circumstances. What amazed me most was how she continued to give, despite having so little. When Brandon's youngest daughter had broken her arm last year, Dorothy had somehow managed to send a care package filled with homemade cookies and small toys. When Amanda had gone through her divorce 2 years ago, Dorothy had written her long, encouraging letters every week, offering wisdom and support that none of us had thought to provide. She volunteered at the church food bank every Wednesday, despite her mobility issues, making it increasingly difficult to stand for long periods. She knitted scarves and hats for the homeless shelter each winter, her arthritic hands working slowly but steadily through the yarn. She sent birthday cards to every family member, including the grandchildren, who rarely acknowledged receiving them. Most remarkably, Dorothy never seemed bitter about the inequity in our family dynamics. She never pointed out that Kenneth and the children had stopped visiting her, never mentioned that their Christmas gifts to her were clearly afterthoughts, while mine were carefully chosen and personal. She accepted every slight with grace and continued to love unconditionally. During our Sunday conversations, she would ask about Kenneth's work, about Brandon's business, about Amanda's success in real estate. She celebrated their achievements as if they were her own grandchildren, never acknowledging that they barely remembered she existed. Her capacity for selfless love both inspired and heartbroken me. As I contemplated my secret test, I already knew what Dorothy's response would be. She would find a way to help regardless of her own circumstances, because that's who she had always been. The question that haunted me was whether anyone else in my family would demonstrate even a fraction of her loyalty and compassion. The plan took shape over several sleepless nights in April. I would create a financial crisis, convincing enough to require immediate help, but not so catastrophic that it would seem impossible to recover from. After decades in human resources, I understood the psychology of emergency situations. People's true characters emerged when they felt pressured to make quick decisions about sacrifice and support. I crafted my story carefully. I would claim that I had been secretly investing in a small business venture, something I had hidden from Kenneth to avoid his inevitable criticism about taking financial risks. The investment had gone badly wrong, and I now owed $10,000 immediately to avoid legal consequences and potential bankruptcy. The amount was significant enough to require real sacrifice from anyone who chose to help, but not so large that it would seem unreasonable to request. The beauty of the story was its believability. Kenneth knew I had always been interested in small business investments, and my secretive nature about it would actually ring true given his tendency to dismiss my financial opinions. The urgency would prevent anyone from asking too many detailed questions or offering to help in ways that didn't involve actual money. I decided to approach each family member individually, making the same request, but tailoring my approach to their personalities. With Kenneth, I would be apologetic and frightened, playing into his need to feel superior and in control. With Brandon, I would focus on the business aspects and potential legal ramifications, appealing to his professional expertise. With Amanda, I would emphasize the practical consequences and ask for her advice on how to handle the situation. The timing would be crucial. I planned to make all the calls within the same week, creating a sense of genuine urgency while giving each person enough time to make their decision without feeling rushed. I would avoid being too emotional or manipulative, instead presenting the situation as straightforwardly as possible and simply asking for help. Part of me felt guilty about the deception, but I reminded myself that I wasn't asking anyone to do anything they wouldn't do for a family member in genuine need. I was simply creating an opportunity for them to demonstrate the love and loyalty I hoped still existed beneath the surface of our strained relationships. I also planned to approach Dorothy, even though I knew her response would be both immediate and heartbreaking. Her reaction would serve as a baseline, a reminder of what unconditional family love actually looked like. Whatever she managed to offer, despite her limited resources, would highlight the contrast with everyone else's responses. The night before I planned to begin making the calls, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and tried to prepare myself for what I might discover. The optimistic part of me hoped that crisis would bring out the best in my family, that underneath their busy lives and self-absorption, they still cared enough to help when it truly mattered. But the realistic part of me, shaped by years of feeling like an afterthought in their lives, suspected that I was about to learn some very painful truths about the people I had spent my life loving and supporting. Either way, I needed to know where I really stood with the people who claimed to be my family. The test would begin tomorrow, and there would be no going back once I made that first phone call. I decided to start with Kenneth, figuring that his response would set the tone for how I approached the others. On a Thursday evening, after he had settled into his recliner with his usual glass of bourbon and financial magazines, I took a deep breath and began my carefully rehearsed confession. I told him about the secret investment, watching his face transform from mild interest to growing irritation as I explained how I had hidden the venture from him. His jaw tightened when I mentioned the amount I now owed, and by the time I finished explaining that I needed $10,000 immediately, his expression had shifted to something I had rarely seen before: cold, calculating anger. The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Kenneth set down his glass with deliberate precision, folded his magazine, and looked at me with the kind of disappointment usually reserved for strangers who had personally wronged him. When he finally spoke, his voice was controlled, but filled with a fury that made my stomach clench. He told me I was reckless, irresponsible, and foolish beyond comprehension. How could I have made such a decision without consulting him? How could I have risked our financial security for some half-baked business scheme? Did I have any idea how this would affect our retirement plans, our credit rating, our standing in the community? But what hurt most wasn't his anger about the financial implications. It was his complete lack of concern for me as a person. He never asked if I was okay, never offered comfort or reassurance, never suggested that we would figure this out together. Instead, he treated me like an employee who had embezzled from the company, someone whose betrayal was both personal and unforgivable. When I finally worked up the courage to ask directly for his help, his response was swift and definitive. He told me that I had made this mess entirely on my own, and I would need to find a way out of it without involving our joint assets. He wasn't about to throw good money after bad to fix my mistake, especially when doing so would jeopardize the financial stability he had worked 32 years to build. The conversation ended with Kenneth gathering his magazines and heading to his home office, muttering about needing to review our accounts to make sure I hadn't done any other damage he didn't know about. He didn't come to bed that night, and I heard him making phone calls well past midnight, presumably to our financial advisor and accountant. Over the following days, Kenneth's behavior toward me shifted dramatically. He spoke to me only when necessary, his tone formal and distant, as if I were a tenant he was barely tolerating. He started coming home later from work, spending his weekends at the office or the golf course, and when he was home, he acted like I was invisible. The man who had promised to love me, in sickness and in health for richer or poorer, had apparently decided that my perceived financial irresponsibility was grounds for emotional abandonment. Instead of being my partner during a crisis, he had chosen to protect himself and punish me for what he saw as my betrayal of our marriage. Watching Kenneth's reaction unfold over those first few days, I realized that our relationship had been far more fragile than I had ever imagined. 32 years of marriage had apparently created no reservoir of goodwill, no foundation of love strong enough to weather a financial storm, no commitment deep enough to inspire sacrifice or forgiveness. The following Monday, I called Brandon at his office in Atlanta, timing it carefully to catch him during what I knew was usually a break between client meetings. I could hear the bustling sounds of his workplace in the background as I launched into my rehearsed explanation about the failed investment and my urgent need for help. Brandon listened with what seemed like professional attention, asking pointed questions about the nature of the investment, the timeline for repayment, and the potential legal consequences. For a moment, I allowed myself to hope that his financial expertise would translate into practical support. He understood these situations after all. Surely he would know how to help his mother navigate this crisis. But as our conversation progressed, I began to recognize the tone he was using. It was the same politely distant voice he employed with clients whose situations were complicated but not particularly profitable for his firm. He was analyzing my problem with detached professionalism rather than responding with filial concern. When I finally asked directly if he could lend me the money, Brandon's response was a masterclass in bureaucratic deflection. He explained that his assets were currently tied up in a major business expansion, that his own family's financial security had to be his primary concern, and that lending money to family members was generally inadvisable from both personal and professional perspectives. He suggested I speak with a debt consolidation specialist, offered to review my overall financial portfolio for a fee, and recommended several books about recovering from investment mistakes. What he didn't offer was $10,000, a smaller amount he could manage, or even a sincere expression of sympathy for my situation. Our phone calls became less frequent over the following weeks. When I tried to reach him, his assistant would take messages that often went unreturned. When he did call back, the conversations were brief and focused on practical advice rather than emotional support. It was as if my financial crisis had transformed me from his mother into a problematic client he preferred to avoid. Amanda's response followed a similar pattern, but with her own distinctive flavor of self-protection. When I called her Memphis office, she immediately went into problem-solving mode, suggesting I refinance the house, liquidate my retirement accounts, or consider bankruptcy as a strategic option. Her real estate background made her confident about offering advice, but notably reluctant to offer actual assistance. Like her brother, Amanda framed her refusal in terms of sound financial principles. She explained that her capital was completely committed to property investments, that lending money to family created unhealthy dynamics, and that helping me avoid the consequences of my poor decision-making would ultimately be enabling rather than supportive. But the most telling part of Amanda's response was how quickly she began distancing herself from me personally. Our weekly check-in calls stopped happening. When I tried to reach her, she was always in meetings, showing properties, or dealing with urgent client issues. The few times we did speak, she seemed impatient and distracted, as if my ongoing crisis was an inconvenience she didn't have time to manage. Both of my children had essentially performed the same calculation helping me would cost them money and potentially complicate their lives, while refusing to help would have no real consequences for them. They could maintain their self-image as successful, responsible adults while avoiding any sacrifice on behalf of the woman who had sacrificed everything to raise them. The silence from my children felt heavier than Kenneth's anger. At least he was openly disappointed in me. Brandon and Amanda had simply written me off as someone whose problems were no longer their concern. When I called Dorothy that Sunday morning, I could barely get through my rehearsed story without breaking down. Unlike the cold, calculating responses I had received from Kenneth and my children, Dorothy's voice immediately filled with genuine concern and love. She didn't ask about the wisdom of my investment choices or lecture me about financial responsibility. Instead, her first words were to ask if I was okay, if I was sleeping, if I needed her to come over right away. As I explained the $10,000 debt and the urgent timeline, I could hear Dorothy moving around her small apartment, probably already planning how she could help before I had even finished speaking. Her response was immediate and unequivocal. Of course she would help me. We were family, and family took care of each other no matter what. But even as my heart swelled with gratitude for her instant support, I felt sick knowing how impossible this request really was for her. Dorothy lived on less than $1,500 a month from Social Security. Her rent alone consumed most of that, leaving barely enough for food, medications, and basic utilities. $10,000 might as well have been $10 million for someone in her situation. Yet over the next 3 days, Dorothy worked miracles that shamed my wealthy family members. She started by going through every possession in her tiny apartment, identifying anything of value that could be sold. The most precious item she owned was a delicate gold bracelet that had belonged to her mother, passed down through 3 generations of strong women who had worn it during their most important moments. Dorothy had worn that bracelet to my wedding, to Brandon and Amanda's graduations, to every significant family celebration for decades. It was the only valuable thing she owned, worth approximately $1,400, according to the pawn shop owner, who agreed to hold it for a week while she gathered the rest of the money. But $1,400 was nowhere near enough, so Dorothy did something that broke my heart when I learned about it later. She swallowed her pride and began asking for help from her small circle of friends and neighbors. These were people who, like her, lived on fixed incomes and struggled to make ends meet each month. Yet somehow, Dorothy's genuine love for me and her desperate desire to help motivated them to contribute what little they could spare. Mrs. Patterson from next door contributed $300 from her grocery money. Tom Williams, the elderly widower down the hall, offered $200 he had been saving for new hearing aids. The ladies from Dorothy's church circle each gave what they could, anywhere from $50 to $100 money they had intended for their own modest emergencies. Within 72 hours, Dorothy had managed to scrape together just over $4,000. She called me with barely contained excitement, explaining that she had the money ready and asking where she should send it. Her voice was filled with such relief and happiness that she could help me such genuine love and concern for my well-being that I had to excuse myself from the call to cry in private. Here was an 82-year-old woman living in poverty, sacrificing her most treasured possession and asking her equally struggling friends for help, all because she loved me unconditionally and couldn't bear the thought of me facing this crisis alone. Meanwhile, my husband and successful children, with their comfortable incomes and substantial assets, had found reasons to protect themselves rather than protect me. Dorothy's response wasn't just about the money she had managed to gather. It was about the immediate, unquestioning love that motivated her actions, the way she prioritized my well-being over her own security, without a moment's hesitation. I couldn't let Dorothy sacrifice another day for my deception. The weight of her love, so pure and immediate, compared to my family's calculated responses, made continuing the charade feel like a betrayal of everything she had taught me about genuine affection. On Wednesday evening, I drove to her small apartment with my heart pounding and my hands shaking. Dorothy greeted me at the door with her usual warm smile, but I could see the worry lines that had deepened around her eyes over the past few days. Her apartment felt smaller, somehow emptier, and I noticed immediately that her mother's gold bracelet was missing from her wrist. The sight of her bare arm nearly undid me before I could even begin to speak. I sat beside her on the worn couch where she had comforted me through countless childhood hurts, and I told her everything. About the house sale, the $5 million, the test I had created to discover who really loved me, the devastating responses from Kenneth, Brandon, and Amanda. With each word, Dorothy's expression shifted from confusion to understanding to a kind of profound sadness that wasn't directed at me, but for me. When I finished, the silence stretched between us like a bridge neither of us was sure how to cross. I waited for anger, for hurt feelings about being deceived, for disappointment that I had manipulated her generous heart. Instead, Dorothy reached over and took my hands in her arthritic fingers, her touch as gentle as it had been when I was 8 years old and afraid of thunderstorms. She told me she understood why I had needed to know that she had watched my family's treatment of me over the years with growing concern. Dorothy had seen things I had been too hopeful to acknowledge, the way Kenneth dismissed my opinions, how Brandon and Amanda only called when they needed something, the gradual erosion of respect and affection that had left me isolated in my own home. But what amazed me most was Dorothy's response to learning about my sudden wealth. She didn't ask about what I planned to do with the money, didn't hint about her own financial struggles, didn't even seem particularly interested in the practical implications of my windfall. Instead, she focused entirely on how the test results must have made me feel, on the emotional devastation of discovering that the people I had loved most had failed me so completely. Dorothy's wisdom, earned through decades of putting others first, helped me see my situation with new clarity. She pointed out that my family's responses had revealed not just their selfishness, but also how they had never really seen me as a complete person. To Kenneth, I was a financial partner who had violated our agreement. To Brandon and Amanda, I was a resource that had suddenly become a liability rather than an asset. But Dorothy had always seen me as Victoria, the woman with dreams and fears and needs that mattered independent of what I could provide for others. Her love wasn't conditional on my financial stability, my usefulness, or my ability to avoid making mistakes. It was simply love offered freely and consistently, regardless of circumstances. As we sat together in her modest living room, surrounded by photographs of the family that had largely forgotten her existence, I realized that Dorothy had been trying to teach me this lesson my entire life. True family wasn't about blood relations or legal obligations. It was about choosing to love someone completely, sacrificing for their well-being, and standing by them when everyone else walked away. For the first time in days, I felt something other than heartbreak. I felt clarity. That night, I drove home from Dorothy's apartment in a daze, her wisdom echoing in my mind as I tried to process the full magnitude of what I had discovered. The familiar streets of Nashville blurred past my windshield as tears I had been holding back for days finally began to fall. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I was sobbing with a grief that felt like mourning the death of people who were still alive. Kenneth's car was in the garage, but the house felt cold and empty when I walked inside. He was in his office with the door closed, probably reviewing financial documents and calculating how much damage my supposed mistake might have caused to our retirement plans. The distance between us had grown so wide over the past week that we might as well have been living in separate houses. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had received the life-changing news about the house sale, and forced myself to confront the reality of my relationships. For 32 years, I had been married to a man who loved me conditionally, whose affection was tied to my ability to be the stable, predictable partner he required for his vision of success. The moment I had appeared to threaten that stability, his love had evaporated like morning dew. Brandon and Amanda were even more painful to think about. I had poured my heart and soul into raising them, sacrificing my own career advancement to be available for school events and family dinners, using my savings to help with college expenses and down payments on their first homes. But when I needed them to demonstrate even a fraction of that same commitment, they had performed cost-benefit analyses and found me lacking. The cruelest part was how easily they had been able to rationalize their abandonment. They had convinced themselves that refusing to help me was actually the responsible thing to do, that enabling my poor financial decisions would be harmful rather than supportive. They had reframed their selfishness as wisdom, their coldness as tough love. But Dorothy's response had illuminated something even more troubling about my family dynamics. Over the years, I gradually trained Kenneth and my children to see me as infinitely available, endlessly forgiving, and perpetually stable. I had never asked for help, never admitted vulnerability, never created situations where they needed to choose between their comfort and my well-being. In trying to be the perfect wife and mother, I had accidentally taught them that I didn't require the same care and consideration they expected from me. This realization brought a different kind of pain, the recognition that I had been complicit in creating these one-sided relationships. By never setting boundaries, never asking for reciprocity, never demanding the respect I deserved, I had enabled their selfish behavior and allowed it to become the foundation of how we interacted. But understanding how we had arrived at this point didn't make the betrayal hurt any less. These were the people I had trusted with my heart, the ones I had assumed would stand by me through any crisis. Learning that their love was transactional, contingent on my continued usefulness and financial stability felt like discovering that my entire adult life had been built on quicksand. As I sat alone in my kitchen that night, listening to Kenneth's muffled voice through his office door as he made yet another phone call to discuss my financial irresponsibility, I realized that I had a choice to make. I could continue living in relationships that diminished me, or I could use my newfound clarity and resources to build a life centered around the kind of authentic love Dorothy had always shown me. The decision, when it finally came, felt surprisingly easy. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it began that very evening as I sat in my kitchen, finally seeing my life with absolute clarity. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of power that had nothing to do with anger or revenge and everything to do with truth and self-respect. I was 59 years old, financially secure beyond my wildest dreams, and completely free to choose who deserved a place in my future. The next morning, I began taking concrete steps to reclaim my life. First, I called the bank and opened a separate account for the proceeds from the house sale, ensuring that Kenneth would have no legal claim to money that was rightfully mine. I had married him before the inheritance, but the property itself had been specifically left to me, making it my separate asset under Tennessee law. Then I scheduled a consultation with one of Nashville's top family law attorneys. I wasn't ready to file for divorce immediately, but I wanted to understand my options and protect my interests. The lawyer confirmed what I had suspected: Kenneth's recent behavior and our deteriorating relationship provided clear grounds for separation, and my financial independence meant I could afford to make decisions based on what I wanted rather than what I could afford. But the most important step was visiting Dorothy again to begin making immediate amends for the pain my test had caused her. I drove to the pawn shop where she had left her mother's bracelet and purchased it back, paying extra to ensure she could wear it again before the day was over. The relief on her face when I placed it back on her wrist was worth more than all $5 million. I also insisted on repaying every person who had contributed to Dorothy's fund. Mrs. Patterson initially refused to take back her grocery money, insisting that helping family was never a burden. Tom Williams tried to give me his hearing aid money as a gift, saying he was just happy I was safe. The church ladies acted like I was insulting them by offering repayment for what they considered a blessing to be able to help. But I persisted, explaining that allowing them to keep their sacrifices when I didn't actually need them would make me feel worse, not better. Eventually, they all accepted repayment with the understanding that their willingness to help had meant everything to me and that their generosity had taught me profound lessons about real community and love. Over the following weeks, I began making plans that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. I would leave Kenneth not in anger, but with a peaceful recognition that we had grown into incompatible people who brought out the worst in each other. I would maintain polite but distant relationships with Brandon and Amanda, treating them with the same surface-level courtesy they had shown me, but never again expecting more than they were capable of giving. Most importantly, I would build a new life centered around Dorothy and the kind of authentic relationships she had modeled for me. I would use my resources not to buy affection or influence, but to create meaningful connections with people who understood that love was about showing up, making sacrifices, and choosing each other every day, regardless of circumstances. The old Victoria had spent decades trying to earn love through usefulness and perfection. The new Victoria would surround herself only with people who loved her, simply because she existed, people who would sell their treasures and borrow from friends, rather than let her face any crisis alone. For the first time in years, I felt genuinely excited about my future. The first priority in rebuilding my life was ensuring that Dorothy's kindness didn't leave her worse off than before my deception. Beyond retrieving her mother's bracelet and repaying her contributors, I was determined to address the financial struggles that had made my fake crisis so devastating for her to navigate. Dorothy had spent her entire adult life giving to others, and it was time someone gave back to her with the same generous spirit. But I knew her well enough to understand that she would resist any gesture that felt like charity or pity. The approach had to honor her dignity while genuinely improving her circumstances. I started by researching properties in areas she had always admired, particularly the older neighborhoods, with mature trees and established gardens. Dorothy had mentioned countless times over the years how much she missed having space to grow flowers, how she dreamed of having a little yard where she could sit outside with her morning coffee and watch birds visit a feeder. After weeks of careful searching, I found the perfect place, a small cottage in the Belmont neighborhood, about 20 minutes from where I lived. It had 2 bedrooms, a cozy front porch, and most importantly, a backyard filled with established rose bushes, fruit trees, and enough space for the vegetable garden Dorothy had always wanted to plant. The house needed some updating, but the bones were solid and the character was exactly what Dorothy would love. Built in the 1940s, it had original hardwood floors, tall ceilings, and the kind of thoughtful details that modern homes often lacked. The asking price was reasonable enough that purchasing it wouldn't even make a significant dent in my resources. But buying the house was the easy part. Convincing Dorothy to accept it required all the persuasive skills I had developed over 3 decades in human resources. I started by asking if she would help me with a project, explaining that I was considering purchasing an investment property and needed her opinion about whether it would be suitable for an older tenant. We spent a lovely afternoon touring the cottage together, and I watched Dorothy's face light up as she examined the kitchen garden space and tested the afternoon sunlight in what would become her bedroom. She offered thoughtful suggestions about minor improvements and practical considerations, completely unaware that I was already mentally decorating the space according to her preferences. That evening, back at her cramped apartment, I told her the truth about why I had wanted her opinion. The cottage wasn't an investment property. It was her new home if she would accept it. I explained that having her close by would actually be helping me as I navigated the changes in my own life, that I needed her wisdom and companionship more than ever. Dorothy's initial protests were immediate and heartfelt. She couldn't possibly accept such an extravagant gift. She was perfectly fine where she was. She didn't need anyone to take care of her. But as we talked through the practical aspects, she began to understand that this wasn't about charity. It was about family. Taking care of family, the same principle that had motivated her to sacrifice her bracelet for my supposed crisis. The key was framing the arrangement as mutually beneficial rather than one-sided. I would handle the purchase and major expenses, but Dorothy would be responsible for the day-to-day maintenance and gardening that would keep the property in good condition. She would be helping me by creating a beautiful space while finally having the home she had always deserved. By the time we finished discussing the details, Dorothy was crying with joy, and I was crying with relief that I could finally give back to the woman who had given me everything. Section 14. Building something beautiful together. Moving Dorothy into her new cottage became the most joyful project I had undertaken in years. Watching her transform from a woman cramped in a tiny efficiency apartment to someone with space to breathe and grow felt like witnessing a flower finally getting enough sunlight to bloom. But more than just changing her living situation, this move became the foundation for something neither of us had expected, a shared mission that would give new meaning to both our lives. It started during one of our afternoon tea sessions on Dorothy's new front porch, about 3 weeks after she had settled in. We were watching an elderly man from down the street, walking slowly past the house every day, always alone, his shoulders bent, with what seemed like more than just age. Dorothy mentioned that she had tried to wave and say hello several times, but he barely acknowledged her gestures. That observation led to a conversation about how many older people in Nashville seemed to be living in isolation, surrounded by family members, too busy with their own lives to notice their loneliness. Dorothy told me about church members who went weeks without a single visitor, neighbors she had known for years, who seemed to fade into invisibility as they aged, elderly friends who had stopped participating in community activities because they felt forgotten and unimportant. The idea for our charity fund emerged naturally from that discussion. We had both experienced the pain of feeling abandoned by people who were supposed to care, and we had both learned the life-changing power of having someone show up consistently with genuine love and attention. Why not use my resources to create a systematic way to address the epidemic of elderly loneliness in our community? We spent the next month researching existing organizations and identifying gaps in services. There were plenty of programs focused on medical care, meal delivery, and physical assistance, but very few that addressed the emotional and social needs of isolated seniors. We wanted to create something different, a fund that would support regular visits, companionship, and small gestures that would remind forgotten elderly people that they mattered. The Heartland Hope Charity officially launched 3 months later with a simple mission connecting isolated seniors with caring volunteers who would commit to weekly visits, phone calls, and friendship. But beyond just facilitating these relationships, our fund provided small grants for activities that would enhance quality of life: money for art supplies, gardening tools, books, music equipment, or whatever might spark joy for individuals who had long since stopped expecting anyone to care about their happiness. Dorothy threw herself into the work with an energy I hadn't seen from her in years. Despite her arthritis and mobility challenges, she insisted on participating in every home visit, every volunteer training session, every planning meeting. Her natural warmth and decades of experience caring for others made her an incredible mentor for younger volunteers who sometimes felt intimidated by the emotional complexity of befriending elderly strangers. Our weekly routine became the highlight of both our lives. Every Tuesday and Thursday, we would visit different seniors in the Nashville area, bringing homemade cookies, small gifts, and most importantly, consistent human connection. Dorothy had a gift for drawing out stories from people who had forgotten anyone wanted to hear them, and I discovered talents for organization and advocacy that my corporate career had never fully utilized. The impact was immediate and profound. Within 6 months, we were supporting relationships between volunteers and over 40 isolated seniors throughout the greater Nashville area. But more than the numbers, it was the individual transformations that kept us motivated, seeing Mrs. Henderson start painting again after years of depression, watching Mr. Rodriguez begin attending church services after months of self-imposed isolation, witnessing elderly couples reconnect with community activities they had abandoned. Working alongside Dorothy every day reminded me what genuine partnership looked like, what it meant to share a mission with someone whose values perfectly aligned with your own. 6 months after Dorothy settled into her cottage and our charity work had found its rhythm, I made what felt like the most important decision of my entire life. I scheduled an appointment with my attorney to draft a comprehensive will that would reflect my new understanding of family love and legacy. The document I created was both simple and revolutionary. Every remaining dollar of my estate, after ensuring Dorothy's cottage was permanently secure and our charity fund was fully endowed, would go to causes that reflected the values Dorothy had taught me throughout my life. Half would support scholarships for students from low-income families in rural Tennessee, focusing particularly on first-generation college students who reminded me of the young woman Dorothy had been when she sacrificed her own dreams to help raise my sister and me. The other half would expand Heartland Hope into a regional organization, ensuring that elderly people throughout the Southeast would have access to the kind of consistent companionship and care that had become the center of my new life. I wanted the fund to be large enough to operate in perpetuity, touching thousands of lives long after Dorothy and I were gone. But the most significant aspect of my will wasn't what I included. It was what I deliberately left out. Kenneth, Brandon, and Amanda would receive nothing from my estate, not out of vindictiveness or anger, but as a final acknowledgement of the truth their own actions had revealed. They had shown me clearly that they valued money over relationships, security over sacrifice, personal comfort over family loyalty. Leaving them an inheritance would only reinforce the transactional nature of how they approached love. Instead, I included a letter to be read after my death explaining my decisions and the lessons I had learned from their responses to my fabricated crisis. I wanted them to understand that their inheritance had been their opportunity to demonstrate love, and they had chosen to prioritize their financial interests instead. The money they might have received would now benefit people who understood the value of human connection over material wealth. Creating this will felt like the most honest thing I had ever done. For decades, I had lived according to other people's expectations, measuring my worth by my ability to provide stability and support for family members who took that generosity for granted. Now I was making choices based on my own values, directing my resources toward people and causes that reflected the kind of love I had learned to recognize and cherish. Dorothy was deeply moved when I shared the general outlines of my estate planning with her, though I didn't reveal the specific amounts involved. Her only concern was that I might be shortchanging Kenneth and my children out of hurt feelings rather than clear thinking. But when I explained how their responses to my crisis had revealed the conditional nature of their affection, she understood that my decision was about authenticity rather than revenge. The process of finalizing my will also forced me to confront my own mortality and consider what kind of legacy I wanted to leave. I realized that the most important inheritance I could provide wouldn't be money at all, but rather the example of a woman who had learned to distinguish between genuine love and self-serving manipulation, who had chosen to surround herself with people whose hearts matched her own. Kenneth and my children would eventually discover that their calculated responses to my manufactured crisis had cost them millions of dollars. But more importantly, they would learn that some opportunities to demonstrate love and loyalty can never be repeated, and that the consequences of failing those tests can last forever. Section 16, the peace I never expected. 2 years have passed since I conducted my $5 million test, and I can honestly say that I have never been happier or more at peace with my life. The woman who once measured her worth by how well she served others has been replaced by someone who understands that real love is a two-way street built on mutual respect, sacrifice, and genuine care. Dorothy and I have settled into a rhythm that feels like the family life I always thought I had, but never actually experienced. We share morning coffee on her front porch most days, tending to her garden together and planning our charity visits. Her cottage has become a gathering place for the volunteers and seniors involved in Heartland Hope, filled with laughter stories and the kind of warmth that comes from people who choose to care for each other. My relationship with Kenneth ended quietly, without drama or bitter arguments. When I finally told him about the house sale and the test results, his primary concern was calculating how much money he had lost access to, rather than examining what his response had revealed about our marriage. We divorced amicably, dividing our shared assets fairly, while keeping my inheritance separate as the law required. He moved to a smaller house closer to his office and has since begun dating a colleague who shares his passion for financial planning and weekend golf. Brandon and Amanda eventually learned the truth about my test, though not until after they had spent months wondering why I had become so distant and unavailable. Their reactions were predictably self-serving anger, that I had deceived them, indignation, that I had judged them unfairly, and frustrated attempts to convince me that their responses had been reasonable, given the information they had at the time. But what they couldn't argue with were the facts. When they thought I was in crisis, they had found reasons to protect themselves rather than help me. When Dorothy believed I was in trouble, she had immediately sacrificed her most precious possession and asked her struggling friends for money. The contrast was too stark for any rationalization to explain away. I maintain polite but distant relationships with my children now. We exchange birthday cards and holiday greetings. They occasionally call to update me on their lives, and I respond with appropriate interest, but no longer invest my emotional energy in trying to build connections they clearly don't value. It's not cruel or vindictive. It's simply honest about what our relationship actually is, rather than what I once hoped it could be. The most profound change has been learning to trust my instincts about people and relationships. The loneliness I felt for so many years wasn't the result of being difficult or demanding. It was the natural consequence of trying to build meaningful connections with people who were incapable of reciprocating genuine affection. Now surrounded by Dorothy, our volunteers, and the seniors we visit, I experience the deep satisfaction of relationships based on mutual care and respect. Through our charity work, I've discovered that love multiplies when you give it to people who know how to value it. Every week, Dorothy and I witness elderly people blooming under the attention of volunteers who see them as complete human beings rather than burdens or obligations. We've learned that the antidote to loneliness isn't just having people around you, it's being genuinely seen and appreciated by people who choose to show up consistently. If I could give advice to my younger self, it would be this: pay attention to how people treat you when helping you requires sacrifice on their part. Anyone can be kind when it costs them nothing, but real love reveals itself in moments when caring requires giving up something they want for themselves. I'm 61, now finally living the life I should have been building all along, surrounded by people whose love doesn't depend on what I can do for them. And if you're watching this video because you're questioning the authenticity of relationships in your own life, I want you to know that it's never too late to choose people who choose you back. True family isn't about blood or obligation. It's about hearts that match your own. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you in the comments about the people in your life who have shown you unconditional love. And if this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe for more real stories about finding authentic relationships and building the life you actually deserve.